We have here with us Lucas Miles. He's a pastor, he's an author, and he's done some interesting research on some of the different movements that have tried to subvert religion in the United States and around the world. And so, Lucas Miles, great to have you on. One of the big things Donald Trump recently did is he created this committee to investigate the persecution of Christianity or discrimination against Christians. And, you know, I remember going around early days of COVID and the vaccine mandates, a lot of people in the armed services, they were refusing to get the vaccine because they said it violated their religious views. And the same thing, I think, with kids in schools who, you know, either they themselves or their parents are religious and they're being taught all these sexual practices that go against their religion. And I feel this is one of the big debates we've had as a country between having religious values and maybe being forced to do things or acknowledge things that go against your values. I'm curious your thoughts about this. Kind of the difference between, I guess, the difference between having a value that may regard something as not good versus hating somebody who does something you disagree with. Because I think that's kind of where things are stuck.
Absolutely, and I want to, maybe work my way into an answer to this because, first off, obviously, as a Christian, anytime you have ill treatment towards somebody, regardless of their faith, regardless of maybe their ideology or their morality, I'm against that. I don't believe that we should ever be intentionally treating somebody poorly. Now, if they're a threat to your family, or I'm not talking about self-defense. I'm just talking about the treatment of somebody like that, right?
That too.
Right. Yes, this is absolutely true. And so, but what I hear a lot of times from people that I think are not very well acquainted with this issue is that, there's no mistreatment towards Christians. That's a straw man's argument. That's this and that. And, what we had just had a headline here recently of 70 people who are, beheaded in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and what did they have in common? They were Christian. It wasn't because they were gay. It wasn't because they were black. It wasn't because, they were belonging to one political party or another. We don't see persecutions like that against, people because of some other sort of, socioeconomic, spectrum that they fall into. But what we do see that towards a lot of times around the world is Christians. Now, thankfully, here in the United States, we've not seen that level of persecution. I pray that it never happens here. But what we are seeing, I think, and what we have seen is a concerted effort really against Christians and against conservatives oftentimes, but I think Christians in particular, that we've seen them deplatformed. We've seen them shadow banned. We've seen, I know there's been a lot of studies, and you're probably more acquainted with this than I am as the journalist that you are, is, with groups like the IRS that were reprimanded for their treatment, of certain religious groups, right? And so, we have seen this as a pattern that's going on in the United States. I think that Trump is absolutely right in really, delegating this work to Pam Bondi and to others to look into this. I think that it's very important that, first of all, that we make sure that there is fair treatment, that these pockets of persecution, for lack of a better term, are rooted out, and that we are in a place to where I think that Christians are not penalized for their faith. Ultimately, personally, I believe that Christians should be, that their ideas are oftentimes better than those of the world, and there should be preference. I don't think that, there's a difference between not giving preference to something and mistreating somebody because of that view. And unfortunately, it's not just Christians who weren't given preference during maybe the Biden administration. It's that they were specifically persecuted that time, canceled, and I think that, this is something that if we are to see, maybe this golden age of America that everybody wants, it also has the potential to be a golden age for the church if some of these efforts are successful.
We had another conversation briefly off camera. I know you're working on a new book or coming out.
Yeah.
About paganism and the rise of paganism and what is actually behind this. And when you dig deeper into it, you start finding that a lot of it, I know it sounds crazy, but a lot of it's rooted in Satanism. And I understand with paganism these days, a lot of it is mixed. A lot of it is the practicing of witchcraft, which in the early days was just Satanism, if you go back to like the 1500s and such. But I want to hear your thoughts on what you're finding with this, because it is becoming more popular, but I don't know if people really know what they're practicing, to be honest.
Yeah, no, certainly when you look at what we call maybe paganism, I think a better term for it is actually neopaganism. I think it's different than what paganism once was. We are seeing a resurgence among things that you would not expect. So Hellenistic paganism, basically the worship of Greek gods. People like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton were certain that was dead, and we're starting to see people talk about that that again. You can open up TikTok and you can search through and you can find people practicing all sorts of religious forms of paganism. We're seeing Norse paganism, like worship toward gods like Thor and Odin and others. But oftentimes it's really what you're saying. It's not a purity in one particular pagan practice that's taking place. There's this blended nature to it. It's more of a pluralistic form of paganism that is really going through this revival that's taking place, and it is concerning. I think that behind a lot of it is also a connection to Marxism, to really radical feminism, to LGBT and queer movements that are taking place, even transgenderism. There's some of the early depictions of Baphomet that were where basically this Satan devil-like figure was presented as being a hermaphrodite, that he was having both genders simultaneously. And we could take this back to some of the Gnostic texts and some of the Hermetic texts, and really find things like the Emerald Tablet and others, where there's sort of this language that introduces it. One of the things, though, that I point to that I think has created the most confusion, especially among young people and especially among young women in particular, is there's been a fascination with this figure that is known as Lilith. Okay, and this is one of the things that I really pushed in, and my book is called The Pagan Threat, by the way, Confronting America's Godless Uprising. It is available for pre-order right now. And the story of Lilith, it's interesting. It came from a Jewish myth that was written between about the 8th and 10th century called the Alphabet of Ben Sirah. And in this, he presents this character, Lilith, that was the first wife of Adam. And that she was formed not from his rib, as Scripture talks about Eve being formed, but that she was formed from the dust of the ground, the dirt, the same way that Adam was. So essentially that God made two figures, a male and a female, out of the dirt. And this first wife of Adam, they had some marriage problems. She didn't want to submit to him. She felt like he was oppressive. She didn't want to have anything to do with him. And so in revolt against Adam, she called upon this sort of like mysterious name of God. And she grows wings and she flies away. In different versions of the myth, sometimes she is Lucifer's daughter. Other times she becomes Lucifer's wife. And that she goes on. And then later, as a replacement for her, God makes Eve, is sort of this tale. Well, this has been recycled in pop culture. We remember, you're old enough to remember there was a music concert called Lilith Fair. That was named after this particular figure, Lilith. That was a very female-driven tour, really pushed towards this female rebellion. There's a new show right now on Amazon that was a #1 show for a while called The Has-Been Hotel. It was an animated series, and it starts with a Lilith myth at the start of this, focused towards kids, teaching this idea. So what's the problem with this? Well, a couple things. First of all, it's not biblical. It presents a narrative that is nowhere found in Scripture and not even developed till about, 1,000 years after the New Testament closed, let alone the Old Testament. And the other major problem with it is it starts presenting Satan or Lucifer as the light bringer, as the one who is he brings enlightenment to man. He opens up people's eyes and ears to be able to see the truth. He was trying to tell Adam and Eve the truth when he says, you're not going to die when you eat this.
Which was the foundation of a lot of the Gnostic heresies,
yes,
actually, too, which is rooted in communism, where they talk about it as like the Promethean, or like, the bringer of the gift of knowledge, yes, to mankind, which is the light and so on.
100%.
Which it gets real creepy when you look into that, actually.
Yeah, and all these things are very connected. And again, it feels like you're going on a conspiracy hunt, but like you're a historian, you understand this.
Well, it gets hard because when I research, like, I've done a lot to expose communism. When I research the real early stuff, I'm like, how am I going to tell people this? They're going to think I'm like out of my mind.
And yeah, this is why history matters. It's so important. And, I think that, people, one thing that they'll find with my writings is that I read a lot of source material and I give the receipts to these things. My last book had over 500 footnotes. I don't know how many this is going to come in yet, but it's going to be a lot. And I spent time. It wasn't a very fun book to write because I'm reading, books on queer witchcraft and books on, queer feminism and different things like that in order to kind of understand the patterns and the ties here. But again, it's Druidism. It's Helene. We see a lot of work from Helena Blavatsky.
Madame Blavatsky, who was a Satanist, of course.
100%.
She did the magazine called Lucifer.
Yes,
or something?
She was an editor for the magazine Lucifer, and it goes on to found
and one of the early founders of communism, of course.
Yeah,
as you might have been
and
mentioning.
the Theosophical Society was another work of hers, which had a lot of impact on the United Nations. And so, we see these things, how tied in they are into our culture today. And I think that, I think this is something that people are going to be interested in. They're going to want to unpack. I think that, this book, The Pagan Thread, I think it's important for Christians and pastors that want to know how to, really engage with culture today. But I think it's also encouraging for the average, conservative out there that is just trying to understand the patterns that are getting here, because ultimately paganism has become part of the political infrastructure. I think wokeism in many ways is the precursor to paganism today. I think that wokeism has evolved and showed its true colors, and that is paganism. Wokeism is not it's not just a political ideology, it's not just a moral framework, it has a religious connotation to it. And I think paganism and wokeism are very mirrored in that they both have religious figures, they both have creeds, they both have, sacrifices that you have to go through, and I think that this is something that made it very easy for people to move from woke into, more darker forms of spirituality that we're seeing in paganism.
Again, as someone who's also researched a lot of this stuff too, when I've researched the French Revolution, the heresies that led to these movements, which evolved into communism, you have basically two different types, at least as far as I've traced it. Of course, you have the Rosicrucians, and I mentioned the Albigensians and so on. But you had this idea of what some people would just call naturism, which was the idea that there is no such thing as good and evil. And so what they believed basically, and this is important because this is where a lot of the current issues we have come in now. They believe basically that anything that emerges from human nature is righteous, right? If there's no such thing as good and evil, then what is evil and what is good? Anything that restrains you is evil in that perspective. And so they call morality evil. That's what they do. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Satanism is just the intentional inversion of religion. So they will just intentionally violate religion. And so what is communism? Well, look at a lot of the woke stuff. What is it? What was considered good and evil? Everything was good as long as it just, emerged from what you desired, but you were considered evil if you criticized it or questioned it. Evil in their sense was if you doubt what they say, if you have a value that opposes. There's the exact same argument that he had with the naturists. And when it came to, again, actual Satanism, which again is just the taking of a religion and inverting it, you're intentionally practicing the opposite of what it is. What is communism? Dialectical materialism is identify, contradict, and eliminate the middle, which is what they call the living soul of Marxism. You're intentionally inverting the moral standards of a society. Yeah. And that is fundamentally what we're up against. And I don't know how to communicate this stuff to people sometimes, so it's nice talking to someone who's done this research as well.
Well, I appreciate that. You look from a biblical standpoint. Look, we see this idea in Scripture that in the last days that there will be where we have people that are calling good evil and evil good, and I think that is something that we're certainly seeing today. That doesn't. I'm not saying that means that Jesus is coming back tomorrow, but I think that we are living in times that were really spoken about previously. I think that when you look at Scripture in particular, one of the best examples to really understand what's happening today is the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was that inversion. It was God makes a promise that he's never going to flood the earth again, but people come back after that, doubting God and in rebellion against him. They build a tower, a tall city, in order to buffer themselves against this God that they didn't trust at that moment. And that's not an issue with God, that's an issue with man. And so what does God do? He eventually, confuses the languages and spreads the people out so that they're not able to do this. Well, what we're seeing today, I think because of technology, because of AI, because of just the globalist society that we live in many ways, we are seeing sort of this reconstitution of the Tower of Babel. And I think in many ways that's what this push for one world government is, this push towards, kind of socialist, state structures and these things. And we're seeing that kind of come together. And so what's our response to that? I think our response to that is, as Christians and as conservatives, I think coming back to primary truths, to what are these absolute truths that we hold to? As Christians, one of the things that I hold to is that God is a creator. And when you believe that God is a creator, what does that do? Well, first of all, it gets rid of earth worship. It gets rid of Gaiaism, right? We no longer see Mother Earth as our benefactor. We see that we're here as a steward to take care of this thing that God has made. The God as creator also sets us straight on gender, sexuality, on marriage. We see a divine order that is imprinted in us as a civilization, as people, that is from God, that he is the author of, and that we therefore submit to and follow. And so we could go through something like the Apostles' Creed that has these basic tenets of the Christian faith, and each one of those actually safeguard us against heresy. They safeguard us against this pagan, resurgence that's taking place. But, obviously we have a lot of work to do. There's so much biblical ignorance, I think, today. There's all these preconceived biases against, faith and religion. And so as we're on, kind of full circle here, as we're on college campuses talking to people, oftentimes we have to figure out really what's the barrier for them individually. We see church hurt as a reason for that. A lot of times we have people that, almost in every story I hear, when somebody is really categorically against God, I will usually lean over to somebody and say, I almost guarantee you they grew up in the church, right? And they have some sort of hurt by a pastor, or their parents got a divorce, and when they were in the church, or, something like that. And that trauma has created a bias against faith, and so they're looking for every alternative, and they're grabbing a hold of things. And unfortunately, things like communism and paganism are there willing and ready to say, we'll take you, come on in. And they speak to and they kind of stroke some of those issues of the heart that I think satiate them temporarily. But what they don't realize is they're being brought into a really significant snare that is not going to just harm them, but it's going to harm generations of people if that's allowed to go to fruition.
So, Lucas, where can people find your books?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Pagan Thread's available wherever books are sold. You can go on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, ChristianBooks.com. You can head over to lucasmiles.org, find that as well. And I'm excited to get this one out. It's really, in many ways, my book, The Christian Left, and then Woke Jesus. This is sort of a third part, although we're not advertising as a trilogy. You can read all of these independent from each other. As a writer, I see this as sort of a series, if you will, of really working through some of these issues of wokeism that were taking place. And this is really the fulfillment of that we're seeing in paganism.
Hey, Lucas Miles, always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.